was they went to Zabars. It's at the same time, and that's where the quotation comes from, you have, and he correctly, we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of Sally Priesand being ordained as a rabbi. A few years later, you have Ezrat Nashim, and in between, you have Shlomo Riskin, and you have the first women's tefillot. So you can have those two things living simultaneously within the same area of life. The only other point I want to make about this time period that I discussed and Deborah discussed is we were talking almost exclusively about Jews who are doing well and who are moving to better neighborhoods. But remember, not everyone advances at the same rate. I'm thinking about Michael Gold's Jews Without Money. During the same time period, there are people who are not doing well. And in fact, there are new neighborhoods that are built that are not classy neighborhoods like the Grand Concourse. I'm thinking of Irving Howe growing up in the South Bronx, where there's a very vibrant, radical community among people who've not made it in America. So keep that in mind. When we talk about people who move from first, second to third, these are people who are doing well and who are fashioning different types of Judaism, people who are advancing within America. And finally, you can't say enough about the history of rapid transit in this city as being a very powerful force in keeping a lot of people here. You know, when I was growing up, I lived in the Bronx, as you can hear, and you took the train to the city. That was the sign, to the city. So although I'm living in an outer borough, I still feel connected to the city, and I'm there in 15, 20 minutes. And perhaps my parents can go to Lewiston Stadium during the summer and go to a concert while living in the Bronx at the same time. These are some of the dynamics. So keep in mind that not everybody advances at the same time, and you can have assimilation and also refashioning within the same geographical area at approximately the same time.
Thank you.
Just since we're talking rapid transit, just to let you know, the current A train, the Independent subway, is built 1930s. So that's a very important change, allowing people to not have to walk quite so many blocks, especially since they then are going to tear down the 9th Avenue L. Right? So those become the two subways on the Upper West Side. The other thing that I would mention that's really important for the 50s, 60s, 70s is that you have rent control. And rent control allows a more middle class and somewhat less prosperous number of people to continue to live on the Upper West Side, and that also helps to make a more intellectual culture for the Upper West Side. People who are in publishing or other areas where they don't have the same money as the manufacturers did, but rent control stabilizes their rents, and that becomes important.
Thank you. What an
but of course, rent control is a mixed blessing in other places in the city, and that is in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Because of rent control, as apartments begin to deteriorate and the original residents move out, there's no incentive on the part of the real estate people to improve their apartments, and that leads to another era in New York's history, which is not exactly the most positive era. So rent control, which was established because we didn't want to recreate what happened after World War I, it's a mixed blessing, but certainly on the Upper West Side, it leads to stability, but stability can be undermined by a variety of other factors, which we're not discussing right here, but is very important.
Not yet. Any other comment, David?
Well,
are we good?
Yeah.
We're good?
Let's open it up.
What I was going to say is an unbelievable resources here for historical information about this. It's really quite something. Do we have any questions on the floor? Yes.
Yes, I have a question. What can you tell us about this building? When was it built?
Oh.
How was it designed? How did it fulfill the purpose of creating a synagogue and a center for Jewish community?
Well, I just have a wee bit of architectural history that I can impart. Other panelists have other parts to add into that. Architecturally, all I can suggest is that what happened was that this, and still technically remains as two structures. There were two adjoining townhouses that were purchased and were planned in a renovation as a joint structure that were, renovated into one joined structure with a new facade that was added onto the structure. It was refashioned. This was the 1920, I can't remember the exact date. You have the exact
history very briefly.
Yeah. Okay.
So first of all, the founders of SAJ were mainly former members of the Jewish Center, which is to say that 4 or 5 years earlier, they had invested quite heavily in that very beautiful building with its quite extensive facilities. So in breaking off, first of all, they had their money sunk in to the Jewish Center still. And secondly, they were a bit, and Kaplan as well, felt a bit burned by the experience and were not as interested in creating the same kind of luxurious edifice and so forth. So what they did was, first of all, they began modest. They rented rooms for the first 3 years, from 22 to 25. They rented the former residence of George M. Cohan, which was further down the block. It was a townhouse that no longer exists on this same block. They were there for 3 years, and then decide to purchase a property and buy these two adjoining townhouses, which were then being used as a progressive school. So it was already a school building. It was already served an educational function. So it seemed appropriate from that regard. They bought the building, they renovated the interior, including the sanctuary. That was in 1925. The exterior, the front to the street, still looked as it did when it had been a school. It's only later in the 1930s, 37, I believe, that they will then decide to redesign the building to make it look like a synagogue. It really didn't have a street, a face to the street that indicated its function. So the facade that you see today is from 1937. Albert Goldhammer was the name of the architect, and that was the last stage. And generally speaking, the relatively modest scale of the building goes to that earlier history I talked about. And we could talk at much greater length to the degree to which this was ever intended to be a synagogue center the way the Jewish Center was. That's another larger question.
So one other thing, you've got those murals upstairs. They used to be here, right? And that was a very provocative, also, right, the orientation of, this was not where the ark is, that's where the ark was, right? And
That's right.
Right. The bima was over there, and there was seating on either side, as well as sort of theater type seating elsewhere. But having that imagery in the synagogue was a very provocative choice, because it showed women working as well as men. It was Tamima Ghazari did the murals. And it was an expression, there was a question to Mel Sculpt about Zionism. It was an expression of the Zionism that was the type of Zionism that was embraced by members of the SAJ. So there's no human faces on these stained glass, but there certainly were human representations in the murals.
We're very fortunate that we have the historian of the Tamima Ghazari murals, Rabbi Deborah Waxman, who will be speaking at a later panel today. So perhaps we'll hear more.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
When was the building bought across the street from the school?
Yeah, post-World War II.
Again, due to the relatively small size of the building, membership was growing in the post-World War II period. It was determined there were more families, more children. It was determined there was more room needed for a school. So they were able to purchase a building across the street. The building does still stand, but it was, I don't know the exact history. Maybe someone who was a member at the time knows why it was disposed of at a certain time. But for a period, for a decade or so, it served as the educational center attached to this building. So this was the synagogue and that was the center.
Our son
went to the nursery school, and then I think they sold it because they needed the money.
So one of the things that was really innovative was that they created a Hebrew high school at one point. That was a cooperative arrangement with B'nai Jeshurun and what's the one across the park? No, on the east side, Park Avenue. Thank you, and Park Avenue Synagogue. And it's a model that hasn't been adopted very much, but it is certainly one worth considering bringing back because it allowed for all three synagogues, the teenagers who were there, to go to a place, and it had a wonderful scholars teaching there. Many of them were graduate students at Columbia University at the time. It was run by a professor who subsequently became a professor, he wasn't then, named Paul Ritterband, who became a very important sociologist.
Did you mention, by the way, that you grew up in
Yeah,
this country?
I should say that, yes. Yeah, I grew up in the synagogue, that's right, when it was facing that way.
You know, that was an era where they had a whole bunch of vibrant Hebrew high school situations. I'm thinking of Herzliya on the Lower East Side with the poet Moses Feinstein, Marshalliya Hebrew Institute, which is a situation where kids who went to public school and maybe were involved in Jewish life through their bar bat mitzvahs continued. And that doesn't exist to a great extent, but that's, you know, a part of the lost history of this these denominations.
One, can you hear me okay?
We can.
One is, I'm a little confused about when Deborah talked about St. Stephen's Church. Is that the corner where it's now called West Park Presbyterian, which has been landmarked and can't afford to do anything with it being landmarked right now, which is a tragedy. The second thing is, David, on your elaboration of all the institutions, I beg to ask you to please include our emeritus rabbi, Michael Strasfeld, and the National Kabbalah Institute in Anshe Chesed and the development of that in terms of spreading the Jewish community.
1,000%. Thank you. That couldn't be more important. The New York Kabbalah in and of itself, and its reflection of the greater Chabura movement of the Jewish counterculture of the 1960s, of which Michael is a proud member and one of its leaders, that was a key example for me, and I only fell off the list because I got involved in the feminist stuff. So, yeah. But there's actually a fascinating connection between Ezrat Nashim, which were several of those women were members of the New York Chabura, and even within that ostensibly liberal environment of a 60s Chabura, they felt discriminated against in certain ways. And that was part of the inspiration for their feminist move in creating Ezrat Nashim and issuing what was called the Jewish Women's Call for Change. Was that it, right? Yeah.
It's in the back. 5 minutes. Yes.
One note about the windows.
Yes.
That I discovered recently, which is that to go into the Jewish Center, they have two sets of stained glass windows, one that's old and one that's modern. And the old ones look exactly like
Oh, interesting.
so
Yeah.
the person who created those. And my question is, can you talk a little bit about, you did a little bit just a minute ago about educational progression of the high school convention. Because I know at the Jewish Center, which also had centennial, whatever, a couple of years ago, they mentioned that they had two, the shul with the pool and the school. And they actually had two. They had one that was an afternoon school and one that was more like a day school. And the afternoon school died away. The day school shifted over to Ramaz, basically Ramaz on each side. So I was wondering if you had any sense of how many students were there and what happened to them. If you ever did any study to see how many people stayed Jewish over the generations.
So I can speak to Steve.
Do we know?
Oh, and also,
Yeah.
is it did the high school migrate to JTS where they had the I think it's called Rose?
No, that was different.
You know, there were a whole bunch of movements to establish day schools in the area. Where these kids ended up, and I don't know the rest of their life stories. Manhattan Day School grows tremendously. That's one option, a little bit more traditional than Ramaz on the other side of the other side of the park.
There hasn't been a study of where the graduates ended up in terms of SAJ. It would make for a great study to find out. To be honest, I only know where a handful of my former classmates are who attended Hebrew High School. But that's only one class, right? From the early 60s. So, you know, if somebody should do the research and, you know, write it up. It'd be wonderful.
In the bad old days of Jewish studies, so many illustrious scholars who couldn't get full-time jobs because the industry did not develop ended up. You're a high school student. You take a course with, I don't know, Gerson Cohen. You know, that's or Yosef Yerushalmi. Those were the early days of people who were very, very bright, and this is the prehistory of Jewish studies.
Just quickly to your comments, two of our colleagues are working on some of those areas. Jonathan Krasner is a professor of Jewish education at Brandeis University. He's currently writing a history of day schools, day school education, and I imagine he'll be looking into some of those issues. And secondly, another colleague of ours, Sam Gruber from Syracuse University, is directing a project studying synagogue stained glass. So I'll pass along your comment to him, and we will look into it.
I have to say one other thing. This area is also a refugee survivor community, which adds another texture, another layer to the importance of the Upper West Side. When I start thinking of the Manhattan Day School, so many of the kids were not children of native-born Americans, but refugees and survivors who come in and find their way into that institution. And their story has to be told too, to have a full picture of the Upper West Side.
Okay. Deborah Dashmore, Jeffrey Gurok, David Kaufman, thank you so much. Yeah.